So part of Stephen E. Jones' website has this section on having a look at Jesus was executed on a cross, not a stake. So this is part 2, which is the biblical aspect of it. So he says, as we shall now see, the biblical evidence is overwhelming that Jesus was executed on a two-beamed cross and not a single beamed stake, with his hands above his head. So, according to Matthew chapter 27 verse 37, the New World Translation says, the charge against Jesus was posted above his head. The quote is, also, they posted above his head the charge against him in writing, this is Jesus, King of the Jews. He said, but if Jesus' hands were above his head, then the charge would be above Jesus' hands. But clearly, if Jesus was fastened to a two-beamed single stake with his arms above his head, then it should read, they posted above his hands the charge against him. If Christ had been nailed to an upright stake with his hands above his head, as the Watchtower illustrates, Matthew would more likely have said that the written charge was placed above his hands. Matthew also notes, above his head they placed the written charge against him. If Christ had been nailed to an upright stake with his hands above his head, as in the Watchtower illustrations, Matthew would more likely have said that the written charge was placed above his hands. Since he actually did say above his head, this would imply that Jesus' hands were someplace else at the ends of the crossbeam, says David Reed in his book Answering Jehovah's Witnesses, Subject by Subject. The book Facts About Jehovah's Witnesses says Matthew 27:37 also supports the idea of a cross rather than a stake when it says above his head they had put the charge against him, writing, this is Jesus, King of the Jews. If Jesus were impaled on a stake, it would have stated that the titulus, or the sign, was placed above his hands, not his head, says Peter Grundy. And it goes on. There's quite a few. Jehovah's Witnesses and the Cross, Spotlight Ministries, November 2005. The Watchtower has admitted that the Romans used a variety of cross shapes, some with a crossbar, including the traditional crux emissa. The Society has even admitted that such a cross, among others, did exist. Shaped in the letter T, but with the crossbar lowered. It says, the word cross stands for a number of shapes. There is a simple upright stake, called in Latin crux simplex, the crux commissa, which was shaped like the letter T, the crux decissa, shaped like the letter X, the crux emissa, which is like the letter T but with the crossbar lowered. And from the book The Cross is of Pagan Origin, Watchtower, February 1, 1968. But in its effort to depict the cross as pagan, since the Romans were pagan, what else would it be? The Society shot itself in the foot by admitting that the cross with the crossbar, the Tor cross, was used by the ancient Chaldeans, who were hundreds of years before Christ, and continued in general use down to the time of Constantine, from years 272 to 337, a pagan Roman. It says in that Watchtower article 1960, this linking of the cross with sun worship is not surprising, as that was what the Chaldeans of Mesopotamia did. Their god Tammuz was associated with the sun, although Tammuz was given different names by other people. His symbol, the tower cross, continued in general use. Since Constantine was a pagan Roman, among whom the cross was a religious symbol, it is significant that he had a vision of this symbol in the sky, beneath the sun. This admission by the Watchtower completely destroys its claim that the Romans used only an upright stake up to the time of Christ, and began to use the stake with a crossbar only after Jesus' death. He goes on to quote many other things there. But that the charge was above Jesus' head shows he was on a cross, not a stake. If Jesus had died on a stake, the text would have said above his hands, but it clearly says above his head, showing that a cross crucifixion is meant. Reasoning from the scriptures with Jehovah's Witnesses says, in keeping with a cross crucifixion instead of a stake crucifixion, we read at Matthew 27:37, above his head was placed the writing of the charge against him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. But if Jesus had died on a stake, the text would have said above his hands, but it clearly says above his head, showing that a cross crucifixion is meant. Now, according to John chapter 20, verse 25, the New World Translation, Jesus had the print of the nails, plural, in his hands. Because Thomas said to him, unless I see in his hands, plural, the print of the nails, plural, and stick my finger into the print of the nails, plural, I will certainly not believe. So since at least 1958, the Watchtower illustration of Jesus' execution all show his hands above his head by a nail in the singular. For years, the Watchtower publications have depicted Jesus' death in this way, with a single nail pinning his hands to a torture stake. Now, this brings up the most conclusive passage of all, which reveals that Christ was not killed as the Watchtower portrays in their publications. Thomas knew that there was more than one nail that punctured Jesus' hands. The Apostle John tells us that Thomas, who was not there when Jesus first appeared to the rest, refused to believe it was actually Jesus. He thought it must have been a spirit too. He told the others, unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Note that Thomas knew there was more than one nail that punctured Jesus' hands, yet the Watchtower always pictures Jesus as having one nail through both hands. From the book Refuting Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, that's probably enough. This website goes on to consider lots and lots of things, but this has probably gone on long enough.